Welcome, everyone. It's Monday, and we're off to yet another good start for the industry. This is the TDR Traded Black podcast. I'm your host, sdales. Hope you all had a great weekend. Hope there's not a lot of Lions fans here on the podcast here today. Woo-hoo. Anyways, let's get to it here today. We got on some big guests, including cannabis lobbyist and advocate Don Murphy. We're going to touch on him and basically speak to him on his recent trip to New Hampshire, some of the conversations he had with some of the candidates running for the presidential campaign, and what are some of the conversations he had and feedback related to Schedule 3, along with safer banking. We get all those kinds of updates, and needless to say as well, the information pertaining to the HHS document and some of the conversations he had with some political leaders in regards to that as well. So let's welcome in TDR co-host Anthony Verrill. Happy Monday. Good to see you.
Good. Happy Monday. Good to see you.
That was a long, drawn-out intro. I was tripping over my words, but needless to say, and I've said that probably 3 or 4 times now in the first 60 seconds, so I won't say that again. But
what, needless to say?
Needless to say. I keep saying that over and over.
We've all got those phrases that once you start doing this, just come and come.
I know. So let's, without further ado, let's bring in cannabis lobbyist and advocate Don Murphy, a friend of the podcast, back to the podcast. Mitch, we bring up Mr. Murphy, and it's good to see you.
Good to be seen, gentlemen. First of all, let me just say I'm a Ravens fan, being from Baltimore, and I feel sorry for Detroit. I mean, I was sort of more upset about that, and then even my own team went losing because they've never been there. I was cheering for them almost all season, except when we played them. But I will say, it had to be worse because they were ahead by 17 points and then blew it in the end. We never really were into that game, so we knew it was bad.
What do you think about Lamar? You think Lamar's just growing pains? He's your guy, or you think he finds his way out of there after this contract is up?
No, I think he's ours for a while. I do think we were undisciplined, and not for nothing, but Kansas City's been there year after year after year. You learn to do everything right or not screw up so much, and we just didn't. So
I would say the Detroit Lions, the way they played yesterday, remind me a lot of cannabis stocks. Like, we are riding, seeing a lot of green at halftime, and then everything's just pulled back by the end. And it was just.
I appreciate your ability to stay on message. I'm sorry, I'll get back to it.
Yeah.
But by the way, I will tell you, it does help to talk trash with senators about their team. So I will be pro when I go back on.
Stick a little knife in them.
Good to know. Listen, I think it's been about 2 or 3 weeks since we had you on last. Last time you were on, you were about to catch a flight to New Hampshire for the presidential primary, and with the goal of obviously speaking to some of the candidates about the current and future outlook of cannabis. How was that trip, and what were some of the most compelling information or conversations that you had during your time there?
Well, it was great, except it wasn't what I'm used to when I go to New Hampshire. Usually there's a dozen candidates, but clearly this is the first time really in our kind of recent history, where we've had basically 2 incumbents running for re-election, if you will.
Yeah.
And so there really weren't a lot of challengers. Nikki Haley, we got a chance to talk to her. And you may have seen on Twitter, I actually took a picture with a sign that said #safe banking. And she seemed to enjoy that. I think she would be good if she were president. I just don't see a path for her.
No.
I did go to a Trump rally. I have every expectation that Trump would do the right thing if he were to become president again. So I feel good about that.
You do.
But the best news, I think, was out of Ron DeSantis, where he told me that he expected that the Court of Appeals down there in Florida, or the Supreme Court of Florida, was going to rule in favor of letting cannabis be on the ballot, and he believed that it would be. So I think a lot of folks got really excited about that news. I also managed to ask him a question about gun rights, and he said he thought it was unconstitutional. So maybe there's a path for us to follow up on that in the future.
Speaking of DeSantis, I mean, we had news today around I forget the bill, but there was a bill in Florida that's making its way around more stringent regulations around cannabis retail. Like, do you think we're going to see some stuff ratchet up in Florida going into adult use coming on the ballot, such as that? And we'll see like tightening around hemp, intoxicating hemp products.
Yeah, I almost got to cut you off because that's not my lane. I really don't. I really wouldn't be in a position to know.
Okay.
What did you hear, or did you have any feedback on Schedule 3? And was there much conversation? And let's face it, we all want to speculate timeline-wise.
Yeah, it's funny. I did come up with a time. I mean, I'm now at the point where I do believe Schedule 3 will happen. It's just not a matter of if, but when. And that's why I even came up with those possible dates, dates that I think the administration and the DEA might want to drop the information, make it public if it wanted to bury it. Right? I don't think anybody wants to own marijuana policy reforms, even the Democrats. I mean, look, I like Dean Phillips. I don't agree with him on most things, but he's up there trying. I went to 2 of his events. He never mentioned marijuana policy, and he's great.
That's a pretty strong statement. I mean, why, in your opinion, does nobody want to own cannabis policy?
Look, I can understand why. I understand why Republicans don't bring it up. Okay, because it's not a winning issue. It's not a losing issue. But in a primary, you wouldn't expect to see Nikki Haley up there in New Hampshire, where it's not legal, talking about legalizing marijuana at the federal level, and DeSantis the same thing. I will say, in sort of adding to what's going to happen in Florida, the fact that assuming that former President Trump is our nominee and is a resident of Florida, if it's on the ballot, he'll get a chance to vote for it. And some enterprising reporter should probably ask him, Mr. President, are you going to vote for this? That would make news. That would actually make him probably more pro-cannabis if he did the right thing, said the right thing, than President Biden. I mean, Schedule 3, that's nice, but it doesn't beat legalization in Florida, in my opinion.
So the tweet that you put out last week, I found it actually quite compelling around the dates. With certain catalysts, Easter break. I think one of them was the end of the working session where they could bury them. Which one of those, and how did you come up with that calculus? And which one of them do you think might have the best probability of that time frame to where we would get a Schedule 3 announcement?
Well, they all had their own pluses and minuses, right? If you needed to do it sooner so you could get through the rulemaking and all that, quite honestly, I don't think the administration cares about the rulemaking. If it happens, great. If it doesn't happen, fine. Before the election. Because based on what I saw yesterday in South Carolina, President Biden said, promises made, promises kept. Well, all right, maybe that's all we're getting, his pardons. But he's going to sell whatever happens. He's going to infer that that's legalization. And who's going to stop him? Who's going to say otherwise? I don't. The media's not going to do it. Will Trump do it? I don't have a reason to think that he would, unless he sees this coming down the road and says, hey, if I'm going to get asked about legalization in Florida, maybe I should get out in front of it and make Biden make him look bad. That's what I would do.
But I guess it begs the big question. How much of this is a priority for people, like with their presidential campaign? Like, how much attention is this getting? Like, how much of a win would this be for, say, somebody like a President Biden? Like, I know we've touched on this in the past, but do you still feel confident that this will become a priority and would be a big component, a big win for the Dems if they got behind this?
Well, it's funny. I know he's hemorrhaging votes among younger progressive type Democrats, right? They are not ever going to vote for Donald Trump, but they may stay home. And so if Biden does anything to encourage them to come out and vote, that's a win for him. Yeah. And I will point out that liquid LNG gas, what does that have to do with cannabis? Well, apparently advocates were natting at him so much, climate advocates, that he put a pause on exports, right? So if he's willing to do that, to sort of go out on a limb and do that for a very small segment of his voting base, he might do the same thing for cannabis as well. So it remains to be seen. As far as the dates were all predicated on the idea that they wanted to bury it. And if they wanted to bury it, then it needs to be on a Friday, just before they go on some week-long or longer recess. I do think the last best hope is August 2nd, just before the 5-week August recess. The next one is at the end of September, which would put it into voting time, right?
Yeah.
You can't go out on the campaign trail and talk about Schedule 3 if votes have already sort of started to happen. It wouldn't make sense.
Yeah,
So,
we had Brady Cobb on last week, and he was saying end of March, early April, if he had to guess. And I keep hearing that from a few other people too. Is that aggressive, do you think? Or again, it's just you don't know?
I will say this. I talked to a number of Democratic senators about Schedule 3. They had not heard. I think February and March might be aggressive, but that April date might, not only be right as far as timing, but cheeky if they want to get cute with April 20th, with 420.
Let's do it, Don.
Do you see Schedule 3 as being a catalyst potentially for SAFER, or do you think that they're not correlated whatsoever?
Nope. In fact, I think it hurts, right?
Okay.
I think there's a fair amount of belief on the Hill and elsewhere that if you have Schedule 3, you don't need safe banking.
Yeah.
So it takes a little bit of the wind out of the sails for that.
Okay.
I would rather get safe first. So as far as Schedule 3, I'm really in no hurry.
Yeah. Well, let's focus on that because I know you have a lot of, background with safe banking, and something I wanted to bring up actually from one of our viewers. It involves back in October, Senator Steve Daines from Montana, which is one of the, if not the leading co-sponsor of safer banking. He indicated he wouldn't want the bill to come to the Senate floor until he felt confident the bill would be able to get through the House. So based off of that, do you really think that really is in play? And is that common, I guess, for this type of legislation?
Well, let me just say, this is not common legislation. This is legislation that was orchestrated, coordinated, calculated by both parties in both chambers. So they really want it. I mean, I've been seeing this, for a year, and I know everybody's unhappy with Schumer, and I'd like to beat on him too because I'm a Republican and he's a Democrat, but I just can't. Like when it happens, we will have him. He will get credit for this. So
yes,
we got to temper our comments about Leader Schumer. And look, not everybody's happy one way or the other, but they're also not that motivated. I mean, in a lot of ways, nobody seems to understand why this is that important, right? Which also is why I think it could pass. It's not going to be held up as some political football. If you don't vote for my bill, I'm not going to give you safe banking. Nobody cares. They don't care that much. I mean, I love Steve Daines, but how much should Steve Daines care about safe banking in Montana? He's not the guy, right, that you think needs it. I'll tell you, the guys in Colorado should need it, and the members in Washington State should need it. But Maria Cantwell's not even a co-sponsor. So what does that tell you?
So where do you
think?
Go ahead.
Do you think that cannabis needs to find one of these buzzword tags to attach to it to get velocity amongst politicians, like becoming like a climate cause or becoming like a social equity cause even more than it already is to really get these politicians behind it? Or do you think that that's kind of moot at this point? It is what it is, and who supports it, and it's going to kind of go through the motions, and ultimately we'll probably be speaking a different tune sometime this time next year.
No, I think the problem for Democrats is it doesn't go far enough. For Republicans, they don't have a real reason to care other than their banker friends might want it. If you could tie it to be a pro-life position somehow, maybe that would work. It is a pro-gun. It can be a pro-gun position. And that's when the Graham Act being attached to it will get Republican votes. A Project Choke Point, that portion, that's everything to Republicans, right?
Okay.
And it sort of goes to this point where I asked Ron DeSantis about gun rights for cannabis patients. He didn't think it was constitutional. And I think most Republicans I talk to can't justify it. They just don't, if they don't like cannabis and they don't like cannabis people, they don't really want to do anything to move the issue.
So talking more about guns, does that kind of stem back into Section 10 that we got streamlined within the bill? Okay.
Yep. In fact, the guys who really hate cannabis really just don't know what to say when I talk to them about the Graham Act and gun rights for cannabis patients. They're just tongue-tied.
Huh. That's interesting. So where do you see the level of House support needing to be to get this bill going?
We just need to keep Congressman Luke DeMeyer on board. He's the original author of the choke point language. and it's all about making sure he's happy. And once he's happy, the rest of the House Republicans will fall right in line. I pretty much believe that.
Wanted to also ask you, what did you make of Barbara Lee's failure to embrace cannabis reform? Like, what's that say about the Dems' support for the issue?
That is a head scratcher. Now, look, I spent a week in New Hampshire 4 years ago when it was all Democrats on the campaign trail. Virtually none of them, save for Bernie Sanders and Tulsi Gabbard, even mentioned it in their opening stump speech remarks. The rest of them just didn't. And they were all co-sponsors of cannabis legislation of some sort, right? But they didn't seem to think it was worthy of bringing up on the campaign trail. I don't understand it. Barbara Lee is a member of the co-chair of the Cannabis Caucus. She's running for the Democrat nomination in California.
Yeah.
Like, this ain't Kansas we're talking about. This is California. And how she doesn't bring it up in her 3-minute remarks in her opening, when she ran, she put out a 3-minute video. Yeah, within the first breath, she talks about having a back alley abortion, but there's no mention of cannabis.
Yeah.
None. They had a debate the other night. I watched most of it. I did not see any mention of cannabis at all. Among the questions, or even they all had an opportunity to pivot. Anytime you're talking about criminal justice reform, how do you not pivot into cannabis?
Yeah.
Like, if minorities are arrested at 4-1, like, that should be the first thing you want to bring up in a Democrat primary.
Don,
speaking of debates, I mean, do you think once we get debates between Trump and Biden 1v1 that this does get brought up, and it is a fact that they're forced to comment on in that scenario, in that arena?
Well, let's assume they're going to be debates. I mean,
yes.
Right now, that's a question mark. Two, I don't see the mainstream media ever bringing this issue up. Look,
I know.
I brought this up at a town hall that was televised on C-SPAN. There must have been 40 reporters in the room. Not one of them covered his answer to my question about gun rights for cannabis patients. Not one of them. So it was Tom Angel of Marijuana Moment who wrote the story that was picked up elsewhere and, became somewhat news. And, the mainstream media talked about the ballot initiative being legal. That actually got some airtime, but it took a while for that to happen as well. They just don't seem to want to be into it. And look, I've got my thoughts as to why, but let's be honest, you only have to watch the national news once or twice, look at their advertisers and say, we're probably not going to get a fair shake here.
Yeah.
Well, as a former mainstream media executive, I can say you're probably 100% accurate when it comes to that. That's exactly what it is. But this is the future, right? These platforms, like what we're trying to do in the conversations that we're having, is trying to shed light. And I firmly believe that, look, this audience that we're doing right now is going to 10x when we do see rescheduling, because it's going to garner more and more attention. And from the conversations I've had with even executives at CNBC, you can tell that they don't understand the space because they're still bringing up top storylines from 5 years ago. It's just like, let's stay in the moment because there's a lot to learn. But to your point, with the advertisers in the background, they do have a say, and that's 100% probably accurate. Would you best describe, like, do you seem like you're a little frustrated with what's gone on the last couple of weeks just by the lack of dialogue, or am I misunderstanding that?
No, I'm very frustrated. I'm not a little frustrated. I'm very frustrated. And back to your earlier point, look, I can barely even stand to watch prime time on Fox News Channel anymore because their host seems so out of touch and out of step with everything they say. But when it comes to cannabis, it's like, wait a second, where's that liberty and freedom when it comes to cannabis?
Yeah.
You want to complain about the Biden administration dialing back on menthol, right? No, we can't have any menthol cigarettes, and that's crazy. That's terrible. Well, why doesn't that apply to cannabis? I just don't get it, right? And if somebody thinks that we're going to fund terrorism with menthol cigarettes, black market menthol cigarettes, doesn't that apply to cannabis? I'm sorry, it does.
Yeah.
It should be that obvious. But anyway, I'm just there to make people look bad.
Don, mainstream media is more about ideology versus actual facts. That's what it's about in this day and age, right? But Listen, don't be frustrated. You're still doing great work. And I don't know if there's anything else that, was there any other questions that you wanted to touch on, Anthony?
No, we covered everything. We got Anthony's, we got some of the user submitted questions. I mean, this has been great. It was great because someone actually deemed you Don the Baptist on Twitter last week. It's great that all you do, Don. And I mean, it is great to have you as a correspondent to the show. And be able to get you on and get some real insights as to what's going on. Because we'd be in the dark.
I talked to Anthony too
without you.
Our last conversation. We are going to get on location with you. So we got to figure out what we're going to do storyline wise. We'll probably listen to our viewers, but if there's stuff going on in Washington or on the road, we have got to do a road trip with you.
Yeah.
Well, listen, I want to say one thing to your viewers and the people in your space.
Yeah.
Most of you, whether you realize it or not, have access to these elected officials. You need to be whispering in their ear. They need to hear from people they trust, right?
Said.
One of the things about me is that I've been there long enough that, they understand I'm not going to give them bad information, right?
Yeah.
And so they trust me. And I've told some of these members, I wouldn't even vote for this bill. I just would not. So they get it. And they trust people that they trust, right? They'll listen to people that they trust. There are people on this call and there are people watching who have relationships with elected officials that you need to be a part of this. You need to be a part of the solution. And it's funny when you start to get into this space. As a former elected official, when I started doing medical cannabis reform, I had so many people, come to me at these community meetings and they'd whisper in my ear, yeah, I use it. Or my cousin had used cannabis and blah, blah, blah. And, I'm like, well, you certainly didn't call the cops on them, did you? No, I didn't. Well, that's why you should be like with me on this, right? You're an elected official. You can move the needle on this way more than any one of us can.
Maybe we need to just get our audience, fly everybody in. We'll make all this money, win the lottery, bring everybody in, and we just do this big event in Washington. That's what I think would be an ideal thing to do.
Well, I think that sounds great, but you could also just pick up the phone. That's a little easier, right? That's, doing a big fly-in involves a lot of effort and advanced work. Let me tell you something. You may have seen on Twitter, Kyle Turley showed up in New Hampshire.
Yeah.
They were following me on Twitter and they reached out and said, what can we do to help? And I said, when can you be here? Because elected officials were here, potential presidents were here, the news media was here. Like, where else would you want to be if you were trying to advance a cause? Yeah. This is where you got to be in New Hampshire, whether you like it or not.
Yeah.
Like, before the end of the day, he had gotten on a plane from Nashville, flown to New Hampshire, and there he was, and we were making the rounds. So there are folks who can do more. Everybody just needs to step it up just a little bit, and we'll end this, this war on drugs and war on cannabis.
I hear that more often than not, is that we need to have more support, more conversation. I'm just shocked that we haven't had more, even from some of the companies in the space that are in Washington, especially at this day and age and the stage that we're at. We're close, but there needs to be a lot more conversation that's being had.
Yeah, and let me speak to that just a little bit. I've sort of gotten in a tussle with Boris Jordan, who I've never met, I've never talked to, but I feel a little bad because he made some comments and people reached out to me and said, is this true? And I'm like, well, my sources say otherwise. There's no joint hearing. There's no joint committee. There's none of this stuff. That's just, too often it's just a pun.
Yeah.
I think he got some bad intel. There clearly are negotiations going on for sure, but I do give him a lot of credit for coming on your show and others talking about things that most other folks don't share in the industry. So, props to him for doing that. Look, we all get bad information and sometimes we share it and then we're like, wish I hadn't said that. But it probably beats not sharing it all.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, especially in this space and on Twitter, you're damned if you do sometimes and you're damned if you don't.
Yeah.
It's definitely very true that Boris is a wealth of knowledge and information. And sometimes he's just, you can't help but get it from the wrong source.
That's a great way of positioning it, Don. Listen, you're a class act. Keep up the great work. And most importantly, let's keep in touch. Okay.
Will do. Thanks.
Thank you, Don.
Thanks, Don. All right. That was a great conversation. Needless to, well, there it is again. There's the fifth, sixth time I said it now. But always great speaking with him. Kind of paints the picture as to like what we're going to, well, what we're hearing, what we're seeing. And most importantly, I think trying to get an idea on when we think rescheduling could indeed happen. So now time for our next segment. I just want to check real quick. Mitch, are we good to go? Is Dan's back end all good and we're ready to fire away? Mitch, you there?
One way to find out.
Only one way to find out. All right.
We should be good to go.
Mr. Dan Ahrens from AdvisorShares, MSOs. Dan, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yes.
Sorry about the glitches earlier. My systems don't seem to like you for some reason. But I'm here.
Heck? How are things? Good?
Good. I like a green day. Fantastic listening to Don. We think the world of Don, and we're going to have him on as a guest on our little noon live stream later this week. Mackenzie's going to go on a field trip with Don. So
nice.
He's always good to listen to.
That's good. Well, listen, we announced it last week. We're going to have you on every Monday, and we're going to do a little segment with you. Mondays with Dan, and it's just basically like, we want to look at the week that was just happened, and then we look at how we're prepping for the upcoming week. But we're about a month in now. January is in the books. I like to see like the trend in this industry and the way it's performed over the course of 30 days now. It's a lot different than, say, in the past when we saw a quick spike, followed by everything traced back within a couple of days. But we're seeing consistency. We're getting a bid on cannabis. But what trends are you seeing right now that's maybe different from the past, and how you're, I guess, preparing for it moving forward?
Well, with trading volume, with inflows into our fund, with the trading at the end of the day, I would say it's all been very orderly, and that's nice. And going back to a lot of your conversation with the Don, have we had any real news? Any real news at all? No, not to cause like we're expecting the real federal reform. Good news out of Florida, probably.
Yep.
Good news out of Virginia, probably. Things moving along, but those are small incremental things. So we've had a really, really nice run up in cannabis. Quick reminder that this stuff is, beaten into the ground over the last 3 years. So it has a ways to go, but some really nice fat gains in the last 3 or 4 weeks. And hey, we'll take it. And quick reminder again, not real news that might have a much bigger impact on this stuff.
So, Dan, one of the things you mentioned is inflows, and that's actually one of the first questions I wanted to ask you, because that is a metric. A lot of thanks to Jungle and Java on Twitter, that a lot of people, she's great, that a lot of people really harp on are the MSOS inflows. I think there was one day last week, it might have been Wednesday, where there were positive inflows, but there was a little bit of it was a little bit red as far as share price goes. Could you explain, I guess, that correlation, and really what should investors be looking at when they are evaluating the inflows to the ETF?
Well, quick reminder, I'd like to introduce you to the entire year of 2022. It was red, and we were getting inflows the entire time. So real big short answer, there's no correlation. So stop thinking there's correlation.
Okay.
But now I'm exaggerating a little bit, because these are fairly illiquid cannabis stocks, OTC, and everything else. So yes, buying can have some impact, but no, I mean, let's get things real simple. It's still an ETF listed on the New York Stock Exchange. So let's say you're investing in a large cap growth fund, and there's a red day. Things are going down. Well, if you buy today, you're buying at lower prices today. So no, people putting money into the ETF does not make stocks go up. People taking money out of the ETF does not make stocks go down. We are a big part of the volume. I realize that. And we also compare to the other ETFs in the space. They're smaller. We know that our fund MSOS is the big one, but it's also outperforming.
Very much so,
which is nice. So everybody, people on a regular basis always want to say, well, what about this stock? What about that stock? What about performance? What about this? And I don't like to really get caught up in performance because it's impossible to outperform for every darn time frame. And sure enough, it changes all the time. But right now, knock on some wood, if I had some wood nearby, go ahead and compare the actual performance. There's one little tiny fund that only invests in like the top 5 or 6 MSOs. Well, its performance isn't that much different than our fund. We're outperforming it though. And that fund doesn't have transaction costs like we do. I mean, when we're getting inflows every day, we got to put that money to work, and it costs a little bit of fees and so on. So in spite of fees, don't get caught up in the fees. We're outperforming.
Speaking of the transaction fees, I mean, I know that we had uplistings in TerraSend and Curaleaf to the TSX. Has there been any fix to the plumbing in regards to you guys actually holding the paper versus swaps since then?
Well, TerraSend, we own a great deal of that as direct stock custodied at Bank of New York Mellon. When we get creation units, some of that money comes in direct. It's nice. It's part of the tax efficiency of a normal ETF. Bank of New York Mellon, our custody bank, has not yet approved Curaleaf to be removed from their non-permissible list. I thought it was going to be a short period. It took a couple weeks, maybe even 3 weeks or so, to get TerraSend approved. And I was expecting a similar time frame. They haven't done it for Curaleaf yet. And I have my friends at Curaleaf calling me regularly saying, Dan, when are you going to get this done? I'm calling Bank of New York Mellon on a regular basis. I've sent them a lot of information. They got it caught up in committees and lawyers and everything else. I'm confident they'll get it done. But this is an important education part too. There are some companies out there that wrote their non-permissible cannabis list to be more automatic. So Morgan Stanley is a great example. Morgan Stanley has already removed Curaleaf. You can trade Curaleaf at Morgan Stanley now. Other firms like Bank of New York Mellon, who's been a great partner for us on these cannabis funds, by the way, they wrote their non-permissible list where they have a committee and they got to do all the due diligence and look at it and so on. It's not automatic just because you're listed on TSX.
Right.
It behind the scenes, it dovetails into TSX and NASDAQ and NYSE, but it's still a very manual process that they got to approve. So Curaleaf, bless their hearts, bugging me. I'm bugging Bank of New York Mellon. I don't think it's a huge priority for Bank of New York Mellon, so I'm going to keep pushing them hard.
I'm glad, because I put out a tweet this morning about if anyone has any questions for Dan or on the podcast, and I got blown up with that question. It was like Curaleaf, swaps, what's going on? So that's a great clarification, and I mean, much appreciated.
Well said.
Another thing that actually surfaced on there, which was from Adastra on Twitter. Is there a certain limit of a percentage of a stock that you guys can own relative to market cap within the ETF? And if so, is it a self-imposed limit or some sort of mandate as it relates to the product of an ETF?
Great question. And well, we can't control a stock. We can't get more than 25% ownership in it. And besides that, there are so darn many compliance rules and regulations. The 1940 Act, Reg M, there's tax, there's with the IRS, there's all sorts of tests. Some tests we have to meet quarterly, some tests we have to meet every day. But the real important thing here is, I think some questions about air, for instance. They don't have nearly as many outstanding shares as some of the companies like Green Thumb and Curaleaf. So, but I don't own it. I have swap counterparties that own it. And I'll back up and look at TerraSend, for instance. Our fund does own TerraSend,
Yeah.
But I own additional exposure to TerraSend through swap counterparty. And I own additional shares of TerraSend through another swap counterparty. So that allows our fund to own a hell of a lot more TerraSend than we could own if we were just owning it direct. The same thing with Air Strategies. Now, on a bright side, I think it's not going to be all that long until Air has more shares outstanding.
Yes.
And it depends on how you're calculating this. I think we can call it without dilution because they're doing a neat thing with those warrants, which is there's not a date set for it, but they hope for it to be in the first quarter.
Okay.
That's what they told me. So we'll be able to own more Air. I own Air through a couple different swap counterparties.
Yep.
And quick reminder to people, I bought it last week. We're still adding to Air. Maybe not as much as you see getting added to some of the other companies when we have inflows to the fund, that we've made a way to automate that a little bit better, where the market makers are reaching out to the swap counterparties, they're doing transactions, they're offering us shares. But I've still been buying some Air here and there.
Yeah. Well, you said on previous podcasts that you think history will repeat itself in the short term with tier 2, tier 3 companies performing probably better than the tier 1s. And we look at the last week or two, and indeed that is the case. That's already starting to happen here in early of January. So I don't know if you got a chance to listen to much of our conversation with Don, but the question was asked, like, do you have any kind of timeline for rescheduling? And again, nobody knows, but I keep hearing the speculation of April. But I think to your point, if it indeed were to happen in that month, short term wise, I think you're pretty accurate that these tier 2, tier 3 companies will perform well during that time frame.
Yeah, and you know what? If somebody wants to ask me about the allocations of the fund, how it's made up, and so on, I really like the makeup of the fund right now. It is super, super heavyweight in the top 5-6 holdings.
Yep.
And for people that aren't, indoctrinated in this stuff, look at other ETFs, look at other mutual funds. You are not going to find other funds that are that heavily weighted. I mean, the number 4 holding is TrueLeaf. We have 15% of the fund in TrueLeaf. That's a super high weighting for almost any fund out there. But then you go further down the list in the fund. We have a bunch of, tier 3 names in there, but the percentages are pretty darn small. I mean, it's almost like a call option in my mind. I think those tier 3s or tier 2s, with a rescheduling, with other federal reform, they might have more juice.
Yeah.
I mean, they might have the ability to go from here to here much more than Green Thumb, for instance. So we love Green Thumb, but it might not have that much upside volatility.
ETF association. It's a heck of an endorsement, right?
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, but all is well, though, I would say. I think we kind of touched on it last week, Anthony, in our last podcast. Like, are we starting to see the shorters go away?
I would think so. I would think so. Just knowing what I know about markets, I don't know if I'd want to be short with a headline that comes out from the DEA that nobody has any idea of the timing. You're getting blown out of those positions overnight.
Yeah.
God forbid something happens. One question that did come up on Twitter that I thought was quite interesting. We're the cannabis sector. It's a lot of retail that's buying right now. Do you feel like any of the weightings of MSOS or the way that you're buying distorts the market at all for what people choose to buy? Like they're following your patterns almost with the amount of leverage, I guess, to each company that you're doing in the ETF?
They shouldn't be. The fund's supporting the market a great deal. Yeah, we know that. My friend Sammy puts out some great data to support that. Yeah. It's a little bit of does the dog wag the tail or does the tail wag the dog? So the fund is doing a lot to support things. But you know what? When we get federal reform, a rising tide's going to raise all boats. They're all going to be moving up, some more than others. And we own the majority of stocks in the sector. There's a couple that I don't like. But hell, there's some stocks in the portfolio that I wish I could take back, but I'm not working hard to sell them now because it's not worth my time or our shareholders' money
Yep.
To try to whittle down some portfolio positions. But there's a couple I don't like, and they got some red flags, and too many red flags for me to buy. An interesting thing, though, about retail versus institutional, things like that. Me and people that we know, we talk to people all the time that are on the sidelines still. And I just had a great reminder of how early we are in this process. Just like Don was talking about, a lot of people don't even want to talk about cannabis. You guys were saying CNBC still doesn't get it right. I was supposed to be speaking this week at the CFA Society of New York. I mean, we had a great lineup. We had multiple people. They canceled it as an in-person because they couldn't get enough interest. They couldn't get enough people to sign up among CFAs in New York City. So now we're still going to do it Thursday. It's going to be like virtual, though, online. Yeah. And that was a quick reminder. We are so darn early in the process that they don't have a bunch of CFAs in New York wanting to learn about cannabis.
Now, do you think that's just a dislocation that they don't understand the fundamentals, or they're like they just see it where maybe we truly might be 2, 3, 5 years out from this industry really taking shape? Or I mean, what do you think that's telegraphing as far as sentiment goes?
I don't see 3 or 4 or 5 years out. I
don't either.
As soon as we get that federal reform, the real federal reform, and we can't pick dates. People like me and Boris and Don, we all speak to the same people. We get the same information. There's just different spins on it.
Yes.
About timing. But okay. This past year, I was also at the Schwab conference. We're at a Schwab conference. My company even has a booth there to talk to advisors and stuff like this. Your average advisor comes up, sees cannabis, and they snicker. They just snicker. I mean, they don't know a damn thing. Like, maybe should I buy some Aurora? No, your average investment advisor out there knows zero. And they actually snicker. They think, cannabis, whatever. So that's the stage we're still in. And we have to remind all the listeners, because all of our listeners, we're all in the same bubble. We live and breathe this stuff. We know all about cannabis investing. Your average person is still on the outside and doesn't know anything.
Yeah. What was that event? I forget that was Matt Hawkins was at, and he spoke, and there was a room full of like attorneys, and they all whispered, like, people still talk about cannabis, but that's the truth. Like, when we were at Vegas at MJ Biz, I won't say names, but I was like, how are the meetings today with one of the executives and CEOs? And he was just like, look, the reality is this. How do you go in and speak to a bunch of analysts and banks where your stock was $16 and now it's $2? We talk about rescheduling in a space they haven't followed. They're basically saying, well, call us when that happens because we've heard this story before.
Yeah. And the other reminder is a lot of those institutions, it's not that they don't even want to invest in cannabis. They can't invest in cannabis until we actually break down all the barriers that the big banks have and probably uplisting.
Yeah. We'll let you run, but I know we always talk about the cannabis ETF MSOs. Psychedelics, we'll see how that goes and develops. But, there was some interesting news with MAPS Series A financing round, rebranded into Lycos, but all signs point to the next steps. If this NDA gets approved, then the trial, or I should say the trial's already underway, but we'll wait to see approval from the FDA, which will probably be another 8 months after my conversation with Doug Drysdale last week. But we shall see. This industry's been hit real hard. But I think the turning point for this industry is, like I said, if MAPS's protocol was approved by the FDA later this year, that could open up a lot of doors and opportunities.
Yeah, I think it's huge. It's just last week or something, there was a psychedelics fund in Canada still that's announced it's going to close and liquidate. The Horizons funds mentioned they were going to close about 10 or 12 funds. I don't know what they're closing, but it's too small and not profitable. So we have the only psychedelics ETF out there. There's no hiding from the fact that stuff's been down 70-80% in the last couple of years. Yeah. But I think the upside potential is huge, especially with the headway that you mentioned with MAPS and so on. But for investors, as long as they recognize the extreme risk and volatility And but we like the way that fund's positioned. It's still a tiny fund, and but it has some upside in my mind.
Yeah, good point. One last question. William Gold writes, any upside or inside as to why Vivian Azur is no longer at Cowen? That's the story. A lot of analysts have left this space. No one's really going to know that, but
no. Why don't I have total return swaps at Cowen still? Why did they stop covering all of the MSOs? They got bought by a big bank, a big conservative bank.
Well said.
Yeah, Vivian was a great supporter for the space, a little bit of a pioneer.
And still believes in a recent post that she thinks this is an investment opportunity of a lifetime. So that's why it's such a polarizing industry and people are following it so closely. But listen, every Monday, 4 o'clock, Mondays with Dan. Do you like that sound?
I like it.
Yeah. I think we got something.
All right. Thank you for checking in for a little quick recap. And let's hopefully next Monday we're talking the same sentiment as we were today. But in the meantime, enjoy the week, and we'll check back in with you next Monday.
Thanks, guys. Sounds good.
Thank you for your time, Dan.
Thanks, Dan. Great back-to-back for sure.
It's good. It's good to get a capital markets focused segment, and it's good to get a political segment. And I mean, they open up a lot of their knowledge to the masses, which is much appreciated, and it's great because, I mean, if you took Dan out and you took Don away, I mean, there'd be a lot less information that's available to people on Main Street. And I mean, that's not pandering. That's true.
Yeah. And to our viewers out there, I will say this is our biggest audience to date here today. So a big thank you. And what we're just trying to do is try to get through to our network as much as possible to get questions and answers that you want asked and answered through the network that we have access to. So keep it coming on ideas as well. Important to share that subscribe to our newsletter to receive our weekly research reports from our TD lead research analyst, Bill McNarland. This is exclusive to our newsletter subscribers, and we're kicking off this week our first equity research. So find out who it is and why we're initiating coverage, all by subscribing to our newsletters, because as I said, this is exclusive to TDR newsletter subscribers. Anthony, good show, good questions. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll check back in with you on Wednesday. In the meantime, thanks for watching, everyone.
Don't forget, the report dropping on Thursday will be Maramed. That'll be the first report in the series, and it'll be dropping Thursday morning via the newsletter.
I kind of teased it up. I wanted people to go on just to find out who it was, but you gave it away. But it's content is king, but context is even better. We're all about context here. Have a good day.
Later.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching. And if you want to learn more about the emerging industries that we cover, then leave a comment below and let us know who you want us to interview, the questions you want asked, and the information that you want to learn. We want to hear from you. As usual, click on that bell for all notifications to get the latest information. Share this video with your network, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel because we would not be